Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer was a murderer who seemed to not only kill for the sake of it, but rather the media attention that would come with it. To him, at the end of the day, it was all just a game of catch me if you can. He seemed to love the idea of this game between him and the police and enjoyed the fear he caused. He would send very detailed letters to the police and the media telling them information about the murderers that only the killer would know. He also added a sense of mockery to the police as he sent letters with secret codes saying they could show who he was if solved. The Zodiac's crimes began with the shooting of 2 teenagers in a lover's lane in Benicia in December 1968. Over the next year, he claimed several more victims, taunting authorities with messages. He would choose young couples in quiet places as victims and carefully planned these actions to make sure he got as much attention as possible to attract the police. Despite an intense investigation and hundreds of potential suspects, the Zodiac Killer only had DNA evidence pointing to different suspects, but he was never identified. His letters claimed he had killed as many as 37 people, though authorities could only link him to 5 confirmed murders. The Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy would be Pogo the Clown during local community events and charities, but in private, he would go on to be the mass murderer who would go on to kill 33 young men in his home in Norwood Park Township, Illinois. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured at least 33 young men and boys to his home after advertising jobs in public areas. Once they were inside, he would them before eventually strangling or suffocating them to death. His killing spree came to an end in 1978 when the police discovered a significant number of human remains buried in the crawl space of his home and the surrounding area. The iceberg went deeper as the investigation revealed that he had been carefully recording his crimes in journals and keeping mementos from his victims. All this had been a game to him, and it said that it brought him so much happiness. In 1980, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder and was sentenced to death. But even with the fact that his life was coming to an end, his final words were, "Kiss my A." Ted Bundy. On the surface, like many serial killers, Ted Bundy was said to be a charming and charismatic guy, and Bundy would almost always use his charisma to gain the next victim's trust. Bundy was good at talking and seemed nice, which made people trust him. This was a trick to make it easier for him to find a victim. For almost 4 years, he would go on to commit over 30 murders, with no one suspecting anything because of how nice he was. And with this, between 1974 and 1978, Bundy went on a multi-state killing spree, primarily targeting young women and girls. He would lure his victims by posing as an authority figure or pretending to need help, using things like pretending to be hurt and using crutches or a sling to manipulate victims into helping him. This not only made him seem less threatening, but also provided an opportunity to get them close to his vehicle, only to brutally and murder them. Bundy's killing methods were particularly gruesome, as he often revisited the crime scenes to engage in acts of necrophilia. What's worse is that he would decapitate at least 12 of his victims and keep their severed heads to remember them. Even though he would do these murders almost regularly, Bundy was able to evade capture for years due to his ability to blend in with society. When he was a mass murderer, he outwardly seemed like a regular guy. He dated women, had a job, and wasn't socially awkward. During his eventual trial in Florida, Bundy became his own lawyer and attempted to portray himself as a victim of pornography and dysfunctional family life. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was eventually convicted and sentenced to death. Milwaukee Cannibal. From necrophilia, cannibalism, and permanent preservation of body parts from his victims, Jeffrey Dahmer nearly got away with it all had it not been for one victim who managed to get away. Jeffrey Dahmer would usually lure men, primarily young African-American men and boys, back to his apartment, where he would put drugs in their drinks, and afterward, he would do what he pleased with them. After killing his victims, he would dismember their bodies and keep various body parts, such as skulls, hands, and genitalia, with him even eating some of the body parts. He tried different experiments on some victims, hoping it would put them in a sort of zombie-like state by using a drill and harmful chemicals, thinking this would make them stay forever. In total, Dahmer was convicted of killing 15 men and boys, although he confessed to additional murders. Perhaps the worst part is that the number might have been lower, as one of his victims, who was an underage boy from Laos, managed to escape his house even though Dahmer had drilled a hole in his head. Still, the police returned to Dahmer's house as Jeffrey would lie that he was his drunk boyfriend. Dahmer was eventually caught in 1991 and sentenced to life in prison, but would later die after an inmate beat him to death. Jack the Ripper. With 5 victims and 5 throats cut with almost surgeon-like precision, Jack the Ripper's death toll wasn't as high per se as other serial killers, but he did do one thing the others couldn't. He got away. The murders took place in the poor Whitechapel district of London in 1888, where the victims were all prostitutes who he most likely paid for their services, but unknown to them, they had been paid to die. Unlike these days, where killings like these would be everywhere on either social media or the news, in the 19th century, everyone had to rely on the newspaper or rumors going around, which made everything all the much worse. The newspapers would talk about how the Ripper would remove the internal organs of his victims, carefully keeping everything intact. At the time, education on things like human anatomy was only reserved for the richest in society, meaning the public thought they had not only a murderer, but one who was bright and possibly quite rich. And in 1888, after the first body was discovered, more kept coming. You can imagine the terror everyone was in at the time. Rumors going about that he could be a vampire who drank the victim's blood, or that he was a sort of vengeful spirit killing the immoral people in society. With most of the victims being poor prostitutes who were forced into that life to make ends meet, most of the authorities at the time thought they had it coming and barely protected them. But even despite the intensive investigation at the time and the numerous suspects proposed throughout the years, Jack the Ripper's identity remains one of the biggest mysteries to this day. Charles Manson. Manson was essentially a cult leader who formed a commune known as the Manson family in the late 1960s, which attracted a devoted group of followers, mostly young women, with his ideologies and charismatic personality. He preached a darker philosophy that involved starting a race war he called Helter Skelter, with the plan being to commit murders against celebrities and blame it on particular black gangs. In August 1969, under Manson's orders, members of his cult murdered pregnant actress Sharon Tate, along with 4 others, at her home in Los Angeles. The following night, they killed couple Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in their home, leaving messages written in blood at both crime scenes that read, "Death to pigs." Pigs referring to the police officers to make it seem that this was committed by gangs instead. You see, Manson didn't even physically commit the murders himself, but instead manipulated his followers into carrying out the acts for him. Manson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and received the death penalty, which was later changed to life in prison. The Butcher of Plainsfield. Ed Gein lived an isolated life with his harsh mother on their family farm in the small town of Plainsfield, Wisconsin. After his mother died in 1945, Gein's already fragile mental state deteriorated further, leading him down a dark path of necrophilia, grave robbery, and finally, murder. In 1957, when local authorities investigating a local woman's disappearance had to search his property, the quiet farmer's house turned out to be among the worst things in murder history. Gein had made household items and clothing from human skin and body parts, including skulls used as bowls and human skin furniture. Further investigation revealed that Gein had removed numerous corpses from local graveyards, collecting body parts and preserving them in a bizarre obsession with his dead mother. His obsession eventually led to the murder of 2 women whose bodies were found mutilated and dismembered on his property. Gein was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and ruled legally insane. However, his crimes were still so disturbing that, to the point where the horror films Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre were made from this insane story. The Night Stalker. Through June 1984, a series of murders would be committed in the form of home invasions and murders across California. The murder methods were particularly evil as he would break into homes late at night, brutalize his victims with beatings and assaults, and often commit satanic rituals before murdering them. The police were possibly dealing with a lunatic who was looking for his victims every night. He was known to leave satanic symbols at the crime scenes, leading to his Night Stalker name. His crimes weren't just murders, but extreme violence, sadism, and a seeming lack of remorse or empathy for his victims. In some of the victims' bodies, it was seen that they had been involved in prolonged acts of torture against their victims. He would inflict a lot of physical pain and psychological torment. It was pretty clear that the killer simply enjoyed torture. The hunt for the Night Stalker became one of the largest manhunts in California history, with over 200 detectives working the case. In August 1985, the killer was recognized and beaten by a group of residents in East Los Angeles before being arrested, and with that, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had been caught. During his trial, Ramirez embraced his Night Stalker persona, often flashing a pentagram to the cameras and taunting the families of his victims. What is even more insane is that during Richard Ramirez's trial in 1989, one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletary, unexpectedly passed away. Singletary was found dead in her apartment. Her death was attributed to a lethal combination of alcohol and prescription drugs, specifically Valium and the painkiller codeine. Singletary's death occurred during the penalty phase of Ramirez's trial, and because of this, a lot of the people at the time thought Ramirez had caused the death. He was eventually convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 and 14 burglaries. The Rostov Ripper. Partially due to the incompetence of the investigators and the lack of modern forensic techniques at the time, the Rostov Ripper would go on to murder and at least 53 women and children in the Russian towns of Rostov, Shakhty, and Novocherkassk between 1973 and 1990. His victims ranged from 7 to 36, and he would often engage in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism after the killings. Andrei Chikatilo preyed upon vulnerable individuals by exploiting their trust or desperation. He would often approach his victims in public places such as bus or train stations, markets, or parks, offering them money, food, or assistance. He presented himself as a friendly and helpful figure, gaining the confidence of his victims before leading them to isolated locations where he could carry out his heinous acts without interruption. Chikatilo would also promise financial assistance or aid to women who were struggling financially or in need of assistance. In fact, the Soviet Union during the 1980s was bad to live. The victims were desperate. He would do this before subjecting them to acts of violence, including and even biting off their tongues and other body parts. Despite an investigation by Soviet authorities, Chikatilo remained at large for over a decade. His killing spree finally came to an end in 1990 when he was arrested after a routine document check revealed his connection to the murders. During his trial, Chikatilo confessed to the murders and described in chilling detail the pleasure he derived from the acts of violence and mutilation. He was eventually found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death by firing squad in 1994. Amelia Dyer. So imagine you're a desperate poor woman in Victorian England in the late 1800s struggling to make ends meet. You found yourself with an unwanted pregnancy, one more mouth you simply can't afford to feed. In your darkest moment of despair, a beacon of hope arrives, Amelia Dyer, who promises to adopt and care for your child. She portrayed herself as this sweet grandmotherly type who took in unwanted babies and kids for a fee from desperate mothers. But little did these mothers know she was one cold-blooded murderess. Within days, possibly even hours of payment, she would simply take the helpless infant and stuff them into a sack, smothering them, or allow them to waste away from intentional starvation and neglect. Their bodies would then be discarded like garbage, dumped into rivers, abandoned in alleys, or even left out in the open. Over 3 decades, it's estimated that this psychopath woman claimed over 400 lives through her baby farming evils before finally being caught red-handed. When she was finally caught in 1896, it was massively scandalous. We are talking about crowds showing up to see the baby farm murderess on her way to get hanged. Her final words were, "See you all in hell." H.H. Holmes. So picture this, it's 1893 in Chicago and everyone's excited about the World's Fair. People are amazed by the first Ferris wheel, electric lights, and all that jazz. But while the city shows off its shiny future, Holmes is cooking up something evil. At the time, he was designing a 3-story death trap house filled with hidden passages, soundproof rooms, and even a personal crematorium in the basement that he would try and pass on as a hotel. He was using all that World's Fair excitement only as bait for his evil plan. Out-of-towners would flock in, especially young women looking for jobs or adventure. Little did they know they were walking into literally a murder castle. Now, if you're one of his guests, he would lure you into his hotel under false pretenses. Once you're trapped within its walls, he would now kill you through various methods, including torture, starvation, and even gassing you with poisonous smoke. Some he would gas right in their rooms, others he'd lock in his vault to suffocate. But Holmes wasn't just a killer, but a master of deception. He would use different identities and forge documents of his victims, and there were even whispers about him selling skeletons to medical schools. I guess you could say he was serious about recycling. While Holmes confessed to 27 murders, some experts believe the actual body count could be much higher, possibly even exceeding 200 victims. During that investigation, though, his house of cards, or should we say castle of horrors, came tumbling down. They found bloody clothes and human bones. Before his hanging in 1896, Holmes had one last weird request: to be buried in concrete so nobody could dissect him. Ironic coming from a serial killer, right? Elizabeth Bathory. Let's put you into her shoes for a few minutes. You were born in 1560 to a Hungarian high society. Even with all the money you were born into, your parents married you into another powerful family, and you soon ran huge estates while your husband was off fighting wars. That's the life of Elizabeth Bathory, a perfect noblewoman. Smart, tough, the whole package. But behind those walls, she had skeletons in the closet, but in this case, let's just say bodies. Young servant girls and noble women started vanishing, and people began to whisper that she is not a typical mean boss, she is downright evil. From stories of beatings, burnings, and about her covering girls in honey to be attacked by bees. And the craziest rumor of all was that she bathed in virgin's blood to stay young. Even the king got worried about these whispers. He ordered an investigation in 1610, and when they raided the properties, they caught her mid-torture. Over 300 people testified, sharing stories of severe beatings, burning, mutilation, you name it. The account says there were 650 victims, which would indeed make her the most lethal lady killer ever. But even then, Bathory never actually stood trial. In 1610, they locked her up in her castle to avoid a scandal that would make all nobles look bad. She died there after 4 years without the world ever knowing why she had done all that. Jane Toppan. Now, if you were Jane Toppan, your life didn't start out as good as you might have liked. Your dad dumped you and you grew up in an orphanage. You eventually became a domestic servant. In the 1800s, that often meant home-based care for the rich. Great idea for you, but not so much for your patients. See, Jane Toppan didn't just want to be a nurse, she wanted to be the best. She even earned a reputation as an angel of mercy type. She was always cheerful and super attentive, patients adored her. But the truth was that Jane wasn't just nursing, she was experimenting with poison. So, if you're one of her patients, she will dose you with morphine and atropine cocktails, and then she would climb into your bed to cuddle up and feel your pulse fading away as you are dying there helplessly. She later said it gave her an extreme thrill. But this wasn't just a one-off thing either. For years, Jane bounced between hospitals and private homes. Because you see, no one ever suspects the sweet smiling nurse leaving a trail of suspicious deaths. Now her dark adventure ended when she poisoned 4 members of a super rich family in quick succession, so everyone got suspicious. When arrested in 1901, she claimed 31 kills, later boasting, "Oh my, yes, I must have killed more than 30. I think 31 is a small estimate." At her 1902 trial, Toppan's defense tried for insanity. The jury, though, wasn't buying it. She was found guilty but deemed insane, a verdict that spared her hanging. Instead, she was committed to Taunton State Hospital for life. Gilles de Rais. Let's start with his early years. Born in 1405 to French nobility, Gilles seems to have it all. Wealth, military expertise, you name it. He was a superstar, even serving as Joan of Arc's bodyguard. After his military days, Gilles retreated to his castle. Between 1435 and 1440, it's believed he tortured, abused, and murdered an unthinkable number of children, anywhere from 80 to 600, mostly young boys from nearby villages. His accomplices would lure children from poor families by offering them money, sweets, or promises of work at the castle. Once in his grip, Dore would subject the children to torture. Now, reports indicate he derived sexual pleasure from these acts, indulging his urges through mutilation and brutal killing. The methods were insane. Victims were hung upside down, disemboweled, dismembered, and whatnot. His crimes came to light in 1440 when local families started accusing him of the craziest things. We're talking about ritualistic practices, blood rituals, and devil offerings. At first, Gilles denied everything, but he later confessed, perhaps realizing the game was over for him. On October 26, 1440, he was executed by hanging and burning. Delphine Lalaurie. It's 1830s New Orleans, and you're a slave owned by wealthy socialites and secret psychopath Delphine Lalaurie. Your days are filled with hard labor under the harsh Louisiana sun. You've heard the whispers, the screams echoing from the attic late at night. So when the figure of Delphine's husband suddenly appears and grabs you by the arm, you know your nightmare is about to begin. Now you see, slavery itself was barbaric, but people were saying her cruelty went beyond what was normal then. There were whispers about slaves who seemed malnourished or bore strange scars. All these crazy things came to light in 1834. A fire broke out in her mansion, and when firefighters arrived, they made a discovery straight out of a nightmare. In a hidden attic room, they found several slaves in conditions. Some victims were chained to the walls, mutilated, or subjected to bizarre surgical experiments. One had her skin peeled off in a spiral, while another's eyes and mouth were sewn shut. The city erupted. A mob stormed her house, but Lalaurie had fled. She escaped by carriage, allegedly to France, vanishing into history's shadows. And up to today, no one ever knew where she disappeared to. Locusta of Gaul. So it is ancient Rome, and you need to get rid of a particular noble who you just can't stand. At the time, there was one person you could go to get the job done: Locusta of Gaul. Locusta was a woman who gained a reputation as the elite's go-to poisoner in ancient Rome around 45 AD. Think of her as the Gordon Ramsay of toxic poisons, minus the yelling. In the world of Roman politics, her skills were in high demand. She wasn't just mixing up common poisons. Locusta was an artist, crafting toxic drinks tailored to her clients' needs. This made her a secret weapon for the powerful Emperor Nero himself. I mean, if you're gonna poison someone, you might as well do it with style, at least. According to historical records, Locusta was initially employed by Nero's mother, Agrippina, to poison Emperor Claudius in 54 AD, ensuring Nero's rise to power. Later in 55 AD, Nero used her services again to eliminate his adoptive brother and rival, Britannicus, during a dinner. Surprisingly, after these assassinations, Locusta was rewarded rather than punished. Nero pardoned her past crimes, gave her substantial estates, and even provided her with students. However, her fortunes changed after Nero's death. In 69 AD, during the deafening Year of the Four Emperors, she was tried and executed under Emperor Galba's brief reign. Belganess. So it all started when Belganess came to America looking for an opportunity. And she did, in fact, find it, just not in the way most immigrants hoped. She settled in LaPorte, Indiana, and set up a nice little farm, which she turned into more of a nice little killing farm. She'd been married twice, but both husbands died under suspicious circumstances. The first died when a meat cleaver accidentally fell on his head. The other? The only pharmacy in town that stocked strychnine, a poison, mysteriously burned down after his death. Clearly, there's a suspicious pattern here. But Belle's real killer spirit shone through with her lonely heart scam. She'd place ads in Midwestern newspapers playing the part of a lovely widow seeking a gent with a fat wallet. A kind heart. Guys from all over would show up at her farm, cash and valuables in hand, ready to start a new life. Little did they know it'd be a very short one. Belle would wine and dine them, then, well, let's just say they'd help fertilize her pig farm. She'd often have her victims draft letters to family stating they'd arrived safely but wanted no further contact. Belle would suddenly strike her victims with blunt weapons like a claw hammer or butcher knife, enjoying catching them off guard. Once incapacitated, she mutilated their still-living bodies, removing teeth and bones with saws, slicing off limbs to hang on meat hooks, and even decapitating some while they were still alive. But when her property burned down in April 1908, another convenient fire, investigators made a crazy discovery. They found over a dozen bodies, mostly male, many dismembered. Based on missing persons reports linked to her ads, some estimated she killed between 25 to 40 people. Now, here's where the story takes a weird twist. That 1908 fire revealed a female body thought to be Belle along with her kids. Case closed, right? Not quite. The body was headless and smaller than Belle. Many, including the town sheriff, believed she'd staged her own death, swapping in a victim. Vlad the Impaler. It's the 1400s and you've just had the absolute worst luck. Someone overheard you insulting ruler's mother, and you've managed to get on the bad side of history's most insane ruler, Vlad the Impaler of Wallachia. At this point, you're probably regretting that insulting his mother that landed you in Vlad's bad side, because this guy does not mess around. His calling card was impalement, well, as the name suggests, obviously. It's not just your typical execution, but a long, drawn-out, agonizing way to go. Vlad would have these huge stakes shoved up through the victims' bodies. We're talking entering through the anus or vagina and slowly making its way through their insides until they inevitably bled out. Now, he set up what people called a forest of these impaled bodies surrounding his downtown, and impalement was just the start. Vlad's methods included all kinds of sick forms of torture: burning people alive, flaying the skin off, boiling them, and disemboweling them. Didn't matter if you were a man, woman, or child, Vlad's policies applied equally. According to most historical accounts, Vlad was captured by Hungarian forces in late 1462 after a military conflict and spent several years imprisoned by Hungary's king, Matthias Corvinus. Countess Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova. Born in 1730 into Russia's richest class, Daria Saltykova, or Saltychika as she's known, had it all. We're talking land, serfs, jewels, literally everything. She was widowed young, left to manage massive estates near Moscow. Her preferred targets were young women and girls who worked in her household. Maybe they reminded her of her late husband's rumored affairs. See, Saltychika wasn't just a strict mistress, she was a full-blown psychopath. The Countess had her guards seize servants for extreme torture, including smothering with hot air, burning with coals or flaming sticks, lashing until their skin tore, and using heated irons for... Some victims had molten wax poured over them or were buried upright with only their heads exposed, left to the elements until death. Others were dunked in ice water and left to freeze. Saltykova seemed to derive a lot of pleasure from excruciating methods of torture and death, overseeing many of the brutalities herself. Now, when the bodies were discovered, some buried on her lands, others dumped in rivers or unmarked graves, the scale of her atrocities came to light. Records say there were hundreds of peasants who died at her hands over decades before her eventual arrest. But she gets away with all of this. You're probably thinking, how on earth did she get away with this? Welcome to the world of Russian aristocracy. Her victims were just serfs, property, not people in the eyes of the law. Plus, Saltychika had friends in high places. Any official who tried to investigate often found themselves demoted or worse. Sula. It's 88 BC and you're in Rome. The streets are filled with tension as rumors of Sulla's march on the city spread. The Senate and the people are on edge knowing that a storm is coming. Sulla, also known as Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, was a powerful, cold-blooded Roman dictator and military leader who lived from 138 to 78 BC. He started off as a respected military commander, leading Roman legions to some impressive victories against foreign enemies. But it was when he turned turned his sights inward, marching on Rome itself in 88 BC, that he really left his mark in the history books. This man absolutely seized his control through a relentless campaign of assassinations, executions, and massacres. After marching on Rome, one of Sulla's first moves was making death lists of political enemies and wealthy aristocrats he saw as threats. Now, these hit lists had no process. Simply being named meant having all your assets seized and effectively being marked for death squads to hunt down. He'd make public spectacles of their executions, literally lining up bodies of the decapitated elite to rot on the streets as a brutal warning to others. Rumors even spread of Sulla's henchmen nailing dead bodies to crosses and staging crucifixion massacres. There were 9,000 executed Romans with unmarked graves that began popping up across the countryside, too. It's been said that the rivers near Rome ran red with literal blood from the purges. After spending years purging rivals and rewriting laws to consolidate his authority, Sulla eventually stepped down from his dictatorial powers in 79 BC. However, this was very much a voluntary resignation of his own terms rather than being forced out. New Bedford Highway Killer. The New Bedford Highway Killer apparently got his thrills from murdering vulnerable women in broad daylight along Massachusetts highways just to see if anyone would notice. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, his stalking grounds were lonely truck stops and deserted roadside areas around New Bedford. He'd cruise along, scoping out sex workers and luring them in, probably with him asking for some of the usual services, but then once he had them isolated, bam, he just killed them in the most horrific ways. Bodies were just discarded along the highway shoulders in plain view like they were garbage. Or even sicker, some victims were positioned in staged mock-up crime scenes, like having their bodies purposely redressed or dismembered into weird poses. A few were even found with their faces or heads mutilated. In this case, the psychopath was showing off his handiwork, leaving lipstick-stained cigarette butts or jewelry he stole from the victims as some sort of calling card of "catch me if you can," almost taunting the cops racing to catch him before he struck again. Despite an intensive media firestorm around the case, the guy just kept on killing for the better part of a decade, racking up at least 9 confirmed victims, but probably way more. Then he just seemed to disappear and stop his killing spree as mysteriously as it started, like he got his fill of thrills and could walk away scot-free without ever getting caught or identified. The Phantom Killer. Let's go back to the summer of 1946 in the towns of Texarkana along the Arkansas-Texas border. People were already on the edge of World War II with a mad Nazi dictator putting people in concentration camps when the first attacks happened. A young couple brutally murdered by a phantom killer while enjoying date night at a Parkland lover's lane. The killer struck under the cover of night, beating them to death and shooting the pair with a .32 caliber pistol. But weirdly enough, he also took the time to crush their skulls with some sort of heavy object, leaving bone and brain matter gruesomely scattered. Just a few weeks later, he struck again in equal fashion. Another couple assaulted at a secluded romantic hotspot, the female victim's eyes gouged out as she lay dying. He clearly had a thing for couples and loved to kill them in the worst ways possible. Some claim he wore a white mask or hood, while others swore it was just the face of an ordinary man. The murders sparked one of the largest manhunts in American history at the time, with thousands of law enforcement officers from across state lines joining the pursuit. Still, no concrete evidence ever emerged to hang the killings on any one suspect. Long Island Serial Killer. Now, you'd probably not have to worry about this particular one if you weren't, say, a sex worker on Long Island who liked using Craigslist to get customers for your business. The unidentified Long Island serial killer lured them from sites like Craigslist with the promise of paid encounters, but instead of paying them, he murdered these women in cold blood. His first known victims were discovered in 2010 along that stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. So we essentially have an operating serial killer unchecked for nearly 10 years who, as of now, is still free. The bodies were just scattered along that highway corridor like trash. Some were severely decomposed and others had sacks over their heads. One victim was a male dressed in women's clothes as if to make fun of him being a woman in man's body. Authorities Authorities believe the Lisk, as they call him, was just indiscriminately killing anyone involved in sex work. It didn't matter if you just gave blowjobs to truckers in your free time hustle or were a full-on prostitute, he seemed to really have a thing for targeting sex workers. Over the years, they've discovered 10 sets of remains linked to the psychopath, and despite a massive search for him, nothing ever came forward. As we're speaking right now, the Long Island serial killer could be prowling for his next victim, so watch out just in case you're a woman trying to make a quick buck. La Mata Viejitas. Perhaps an interesting change, this was a female serial killer. This female serial killer who was never caught basically preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, little old ladies, literally. Her typical method of operation was to dress up all friendly-like, pose as a nurse or caretaker, and sweet-talk her way into these women's homes when they were all alone. Then once inside, she would overpower them, strangle them to death with her bare hands, and make off with whatever cash or valuables she could grab. To put your hands on someone's neck and see the life drain out of their eyes multiple times takes, at the very least, some sort of weird dedication to the craft. La Mata Viejitas did this over and over again for years across Mexico City. Witnesses described her as this kind-looking middle-aged woman who could so easily fool the elderly into a false sense of safety and security. And we're not talking young, vibrant seniors here either. Most of her victims were in their 80s and 90s, incapable of putting up any kind of real fight against her. For over a decade, this Mata Viejitas killer stayed under the radar and maintained her double life. Estimates put her victim count anywhere from 24 all the way up to around 50 elderly ladies murdered across Mexico City and nearby areas. Rainbow Maniac. It's the early 2000s, and one day you see this guy at a gay bar in Brazil. It seems normal enough, just another dude looking to mingle and have a good time. He approaches you and asks you if you would like a drink, and you'd oblige. Now, at the time, you didn't know that you just drank a cocktail laced with a rape drug, and you were about to pass out. Soon you'd be left in the hands of Brazil's worst serial killer at the time, the Rainbow Maniac. He'd scope out these Brazilian gay clubs and bars, even use personal ads like single gay guy looking for a bottom to land a date with some unsuspecting guy. Once he got them feeling comfortable and safe when they were alone and isolated, he'd just snap, putting them to insane amounts of torture as he apparently hated gays. He'd put them through full-on torture sessions, like the fact that a lot of the bodies showed signs of prolonged suffering through stab wounds, blunt force trauma, anything he could get his hands on. Some were dismembered and had parts removed or rearranged into odd poses before finally killing the victims. From the crime scene evidence, it's clear he took tremendous pleasure in torturing and mutilating those guys before finally killing them. He'd take it a step further by intentionally spoiling the crime scenes with emblems and imagery from LGBTQ pride celebrations as some sort of sick statement about his motives. Bodies surrounded by rainbow flags, wigs, and flamboyant attire, all used as instruments of hatred toward his victims' identities. For over half a decade across the Sao Paulo region, he has killed at least 14 victims. The West Mesa Bone Collector. It all started back in 2009 near Albuquerque, New Mexico. This guy was just casually driving along the West Mesa and decided to pull over into this deserted area. Except he wasn't stopping for a casual stretch break or anything like that. No, he starts digging in the desert soil, and that's when the real horror emerges. He had brought along a crate full of human bones and remains that he just started scattering and burying out there in the middle of nowhere, just intentionally tossing the skeletons out like garbage. When a woman walking her dog stumbled upon this grisly scene, the authorities were called in. The scene apparently was so gruesome that a lot of the police officers called to the scene just straight vomited or just left. You see, those scattered bones ended up being the remains of at least 11 different women, possibly more, who had all gone missing years earlier around 2003. This guy had held onto their skeletons and body parts for years before just deciding to toss them like they were nothing. No remorse, no humanity, just another bundle of trash to be thrown out as they're taking up too much space. Despite recovering tons of DNA evidence and doggedly pursuing every lead for over a decade, the authorities still haven't identified the guy. So even now, he's out there, walking among us, maybe even watching the case unfold and waiting to add you into his collection. The Jeff Davis 8 Killer. Through 2005, this quite rural area of Jeff Davis County, Georgia, was hit by the discovery of two bodies, an elderly woman and her son, murdered execution-style in their home. Over the next few years, 6 more people across 2 separate residences only miles apart were found killed similarly. Bound, beaten, and gunshots at close range like professional hits. A professional killer was out for blood with no reason as to why. At the time, it seemed like absolute overkill for people living in rural Georgia. From the crime scene evidence, it's clear he took some kind of pleasure in the post-mortem violations. Reports indicated several victims were found kneeling with their arms outstretched, almost like they were positioned in a religious pose, like praying to God, even though they were already dead. Beyond the posing, evidence also suggested he took immense pleasure in simply mutilating the bodies themselves through excessive force and overkill. Many victims had crushing head wounds from severe crushing well beyond what was necessary to kill them. To this day, the person or persons responsible for the Jeff Davis 8 murders remains unidentified and at large over 15 years after the last victims. The Eastbound Strangler. This was the psycho at the time terrorizing the highways and truck stops along the I-80 corridor back in the 80s and 90s. Think of just rolling up to a quiet rest stop to take a breather and stumbling right into the clutches of a deranged serial killer. The Eastbound would cruise those long, lonely stretches from Texas all the way up to Ohio, zeroing in on prostitutes and drifters. Lures them in with that disarming smile of his, gets them alone, and then snaps. Strangles them with whatever he can get his hands on. Belts, clotheslines, or whatever he had at the time. On top of all that, he had this ritualistic way of arranging the bodies. Clothes neatly folded, hands crossed over the chest like some sort of burial ceremony cooked up in his mind. After killing the women, many of whom were beaten and showed signs of prolonged torture, he would grotesquely redress their bodies in items of their own clothing like wigs or bras. Then he'd toss their remains off secluded exit ramps or onto desolated areas near the highways like they were garbage. The cops were at a loss for years. How do you catch a killer who hunts across thousands of miles of open roads? The investigation spanned so many jurisdictions, info was getting piped back and forth like a game of crazy telephone. In the end, they linked him to anywhere between 6 to 40 murders, depending on who you ask. The Albuquerque serial killer. So, since the beginning of 2022, the bodies of several women have been discovered across the Albuquerque metro area, many of them victims of sexual assault and horrific beatings before being murdered execution style. What makes this serial killer so chilling is just how bold and accelerated the killings have been. At first, the bodies were turning up every few months, but more recently, the pace has been rapidly increasing, with multiple victims being found discarded in alleyways, vacant lots, and even public parks, some within days of each other. Understandably, this has created an atmosphere of terror across Albuquerque, especially in lower-income neighborhoods where the killer seems to be hunting most frequently. Despite ramped-up police patrols and investigations, he always seems to be several steps ahead, taunting authorities almost. From reports of him potentially driving different cars and taking trophies from victims to the audacity of dumping bodies in public areas, you get the sense of someone really loving this pattern of violence against the vulnerable. What's particularly scary is trying to game out this psychopath's motivations. We don't know if he's just an angry misogynist targeting sex workers, getting more bold and accelerating a homicidal urge with each kill, or if he's simply a nomadic drifter who brings his murderous habits to each new city. The Colonial Parkway Killer. It started back in 1986. 2 young women, Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, failed to return from their evening drive along the Parkway in Virginia. When their bodies were discovered in those very same woods weeks later, how savage the crime scene was left authorities realizing they were dealing with one haunting reality. A serial killer was on the prowl, but he was just getting warmed up. Over the next 3 years, couple after couple would go missing under eerily similar circumstances, pulled off onto those secluded parkway turnouts, likely for a quiet moment together, and just like that, vanished into thin air. There are no signs of struggle, there are just personal effects scattered in the woods, haunting reminders of lives abruptly cut short. 4 double homicides in all, 8 bodies confirmed. But incredibly, 2 of those young couples were never even found, just gone, as if the killer wanted to compound the anguish by holding on to his trophies. The parkway had to be shut down while this monster continued to stalk its corners. At one point, they had a suspect sketch to go on, but that trail led to another dead end. 3 decades later, no arrests, no concrete leads, just fear. You see, this parkway wasn't some forgotten rural route. It cut right through those ideal colonial towns, beloved destinations for vacationing families. The smiley face killers. So the deal here is that there are these retired cops who think they're like a nationwide network of serial killers prowling around targeting over 20 young college guys. As you see, they keep finding these victims' bodies in lakes, rivers, you name it, all drowned under shady circumstances. But the reason why they're linked is that nearby they'd find these smiley face graffiti markings like some messed up calling card. Now on the surface, these looked like your typical accidental drownings. Boys being boys, having too many brews and taking an unfortunate dip. But these cops aren't buying it. Too many similarities across different states for it to just be a coincidence. They think these college boys are getting snatched up, knocked out cold, and then dumped in the water once the killers have had their fun. A sort of weird game for these people. Some people are skeptical, saying it's all circumstantial evidence, but the amount of cases they've linked to it, you can't deny there's something fishy going on. The case of Albert Fish. Now, the case of Albert Fish just goes to show how good some people can really put on a real class act. See, Albert Fish was the kind of upstanding gentleman you'd be proud to bring home to your mother. Well, at least if your mother happened to have a liking for the flavored meat of small children, that is. Let me elaborate. Fish didn't just kill, he savored every agonizing moment, every opportunity to inflict pain and degradation on his victims before finally eating them slowly. The details that emerged about his torture methods and consuming body parts are absolutely insane. His method of operation seemed to involve luring children with promises of treats or jobs, only to imprison and subject them to crazy cruelties. Accounts describe how he would force his victims to endure burns, beatings, and even cutting off portions of their bodies while still alive. Some reports suggest he engaged in sexual violations with the children as well. Court testimony revealed how he harvested and consumed body parts, muscles, organs, you name it, often while his victims were still breathing. More than once, he admitted to decapitating kids, frying up portions of their bodies and actually eating them. What made him especially evil was his outward personality as a kindly old grandfatherly type. He really used that trusted image to lure targets into his clutches with patient calculation, pretending to be a humble Christian believer one moment only to reveal his true self as a butcher the next. For years, Fish flew under the radar, satisfying his appetites while taunting the authorities with his crimes. It wasn't until he ironically confessed in one of his own deranged letters that justice finally caught up to him in 1935. Ultimately, the world said good riddance to Fish when that electric chair switch was flipped in 1936. The Alexander Pierce case. Alexander Pierce and his fellow 4 convicts were essentially prisoners exiled from Britain to the remote penal colony of Macquarie Harbor. Life was a daily grind of back-breaking labor and meager rations all day, every day, till they died. So, when Pierce and 7 other convict settlers made a desperate escape into the forest in 1822, you can imagine the combination of fear and determination driving them. But as the weeks dragged on and supplies ran out, that determination twisted into desperation. You can picture Pierce walking alongside his starving mates, realizing they were hopelessly lost and facing a slow death by starvation. That's when the unthinkable became their only option. They had to kill and consume the flesh of their companions to go on. The acts began when one person fell behind, dying of exhaustion and hunger. The others didn't even wait for him to die naturally. Pierce himself allegedly took the lead in killing and rationing the man's remains for the survival of the others. Over the next couple of months, the routine repeated itself, with 3 more unfortunate souls meeting the same fate. When soldiers finally stumbled upon the 4 prisoners 15 weeks later, the remaining cannibals confessed their awful acts openly, openly with no shame or remorse. They basically said it was a matter of life and death. It was them or us, and I don't know about you, but I'm not dying on an empty stomach. To them, it was a simple solution to their problem. But old Pierce took it even further on his next escape attempt with another convict in 1823. This time, he didn't hesitate. Within just a week on the run, he killed and consumed his companion for food. When he was discovered back near Hobart, old Pierce was carrying chunks of human flesh, not even trying to hide his career as a cannibal. At his trial, he was positively nonchalant about the whole grisly business, claiming he killed and ate simply for a meal. Rottenberg cannibal. This one is quite the rabbit hole. Imagine going online and seeing an ad from someone literally looking for a person to slaughter and eat. Well, that's exactly what happened in Armin Maiwei's bizarre case known as the Rottenberg cannibal. In 2001, Maiwei's posted a crazy ad stating he wanted to find a willing victim who wanted to be killed and consumed. Weirdly enough, a guy named Bernd Brandes from Berlin answered his call as he had held a strange longing to be eaten. After meeting up and confirming their intense desires, Maiwes and Brandes filmed the whole process. Just let that scene play out in your mind. Brandes allowed himself to be mutilated, killed, and then eaten by Maiwes over the course of months. However, once Maiwes began searching for more victims online, his activities became known to the police as some users on the site reported him after realizing he was actually serious. So the police searched his home and they discovered body parts and arrested him back in 2002. The revelations were downright insane. Maiwes had severed and tried to eat Brandes' genitals. He stored his body parts to eat over time, consuming about 20 kilos in total over 6 months. In 2006, Maiwes was, surprise, convicted of manslaughter, as the court ruled that Brandes' consent didn't justify violating human dignity through cannibalism. The Franklin Expedition. Picture this. A crew of 129 people, led by Sir John Franklin, set sail on a voyage to conquer the Northwest Passage near Antarctica. Little did they know they were about to become the main course on a menu they never intended to order from. As the Arctic chill set in and their supplies dwindled, the men found themselves in a desperate situation. At first, things were probably fairly disciplined, but food supplies ran low. Everyone was on strict rations, doing their best to share what little was left. But then that fateful day arrives when the last scraps are gone and hunger becomes the all-consuming driving force. With no other options, they turned to the only source of food, each other. You can imagine the almost animal look in the eyes as they started eyeing each other differently. The sizing up of who among them might provide the most food. John's looking rather juicy today. From the evidence of the wreckage, it seems like some crew members may have gotten a bit too comfortable with acting on those impulses. Butchering their former shipmates, defleshing the bodies, cracking into bones for that marrow-rich nutrition. It's crazy to think about what other desperate acts those men might have committed as their situation worsened. Stress, hunger, and loss of leadership likely led them to do whatever they could to survive. Even after eating each other, cannibalism didn't save them all in the end, as evidence shows that they all still died hungry. But at least that's one thing they can cross off their bucket list: trying human flesh. Richard Chase, 1970s. Imagine living in a quiet neighborhood of Sacramento back in the 1970s. You've heard the local news reports about a series of bizarre break-ins where people's dogs and cats have gone missing or have been found mutilated. But then the crimes take an even darker, more disturbing turn. Word starts to spread about the body of a young woman found literally half-eaten in her own apartment. Not long after, a baby is discovered stolen from a family's home with the remains of its corpse found stuffed in a box under a truck, partially eaten. So who did all this? A young man named Richard Chase who lived right in your community. An Army veteran just back from the war, Chase was quite literally spiraling into severe mental illness, developing a bloodlust and obsession with acts of vampirism. He saw nothing wrong with breaking into homes to drink the blood of his victims and consume the raw flesh and organs, even going an extra step further sometimes by killing their pets as well and consuming them to prevent his own heart from shrinking. Finally, in January 1978, Chase's insanity reached its highest when he murdered a pregnant woman, Teresa Whalen, and ate her body, including the infant inside of her too. Chase was arrested soon after, readily confessing to his acts and showing no remorse. To him, him, it was just another day at work, eating and killing people here and there when necessary. Diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, Chase was found legally insane but was later deemed fit to stand trial. In 1979, he was convicted of 6 counts of murder and sustained multiple life sentences. The Natalia Bakshieva and Dmitry Bakshiv case. So the two were a married couple living in a small Siberian town near Krasnoyarsk in the 90s. Times were really tough for them. They were both unemployed and struggled to get by. Like, we're talking about going days without any food levels of poverty. So in this really horrible, desperate situation, they started luring people back to their apartments and killing them to eat their flesh. Authorities found body parts, severed heads, and all that when they raided the place. The reports say they may have offed as many as 30 people this way. Let's say it could really have been that they were really hungry, but past the 5th body, one must think they actually started liking human flesh, or just human jerky tasted a bit too good. But here's where the story gets crazier. They were apparently even selling the human meat at the local market, just putting it out there alongside the regular butcher stock. It's pretty much rock bottom in terms of insane acts. The couple tried to claim hunger drove them to it, but authorities weren't buying it as any excuse. So they were both sentenced to death by hanging. Peter Bryan, 2004. So imagine casually going over to a friend's apartment, maybe for a drink, and then never being seen again. That's the fate that fell on at least 2 different men at the hands of Peter Bryan in 2004. Bryan seemed like an ordinary guy living in a nondescript London flat, but behind that face lurked a secret desire, a craving to not just kill, but to eat human flesh. It all started when Bryan met a guy named Brian Cherry at a local pub and lured him back to his place. Once there, Bryan overpowered and strangled Cherry to death, but he didn't stop there. This guy then dismembered Cherry's body, keeping his head and other parts stored in his very own bathtub for days. As twisted as that seems, Bryan took it a step further into insanity. He boiled portions of Cherry's flesh to eat over the course of several days, savoring the man he had just murdered. Just a few months later, Brian Jones suffered a similar nightmare fate. After meeting up, Jones ended up strangled and hacked apart, with Bryan again treating parts of his body. When police finally caught on to Bryan's acts, the evidence was just insane. Plastic bins in his apartment containing the dismembered remains and body parts of his victims, and Bryan freely admitting to the killings and cannibalism without an ounce of remorse or humanity. His motivation? Just a desire to taste human flesh, which he described as tender and nice. Except for being a cannibal murderer, Bryan lived as a strict vegetarian. Talk about a split personality. The Siege of Leningrad. Now, imagine being a resident of Leningrad in the early years of the 1940s. Your great city, the cultural capital of the Soviet Union, is under relentless bombardment and blockade by the invading Nazi forces. The city's population of 3 million civilians was completely cut off from food supplies by the German blockade. An estimated 700,000 people perished from hunger-related causes alone. Food supplies have been completely cut off for months on end. People around you are wasting away from severe malnutrition and starvation. As food sources dwindle to nothing, citizens resort to eating glue, wallpaper paste, leather, sawdust, and even dirt in an attempt to survive. Soon enough, acts of cannibalism were committed by the starving citizens, doing whatever it took for them to survive. Ironically, butcher shops started selling human flesh from bodies taken from mass graves. Some made pies filled with human meat and chalk, while the more ambitious hunt for corpses or committed murder to obtain this source of food. A documentary film shot in 1942 showed starving citizens exchanging jewelry for a meat pie made from human flesh and blood. While condemned, cannibalism was quite literally accepted by authorities as a means of survival in this most extreme of situations. Now, unless you want to end up on this list because I ate you and your family for not subscribing to the Evaluator, you better join the Discord server, the Donner Party. It's 1846, and you're part of a group of American pioneers heading to California for a better life, led by George Donner and James F. Reed. Everything goes wrong when you decide to take a new, supposedly shorter route. It turns out to be poorly mapped and way harder than expected, and you end up trapped in the mountains during a brutal winter. So then you're stranded for months on end, bone-chilling temperatures sapping your strength, and nothing to eat but twigs and rabbit skin gloves. You might just catch a passing passing glance at your traveling companions like they're walking steak. Now, trapped in the mountains with no hope of escape, they soon obviously ran out of food. The wildlife seemed to have gone on vacation, and fishing was about as productive as trying to catch a fish with a hula hoop. As the weeks turned into months, the situation grew worse. Starvation set in, and people started dropping like flies. At this point, they faced a truly crazy decision: eat or be eaten. And thus, cannibalism entered the menu. Of course, in their defense, these were desperate times requiring desperate food. In the end, roughly half of the original Donner Party survived that winter by completely revising the meaning of comrade and family style. The Andes flight disaster. In October 1972, you're one of the rugby team from Uruguay and you're flying over the Andes Mountains on your way back to a match in Chile. Suddenly, your plane hits a nasty pocket of turbulence and goes off course like a kid's model airplane in a windstorm. Next thing you know, you're slamming into the side of a glacial peak at 20,000 feet up. The plane crashes, scattering luggage and rugby balls across the freezing mountains. As the remaining 29 survivors took stock of their situation, the realities began to sink in. They were stuck in a never-ending snow globe surrounded by endless rock with sub-zero temperatures, doing their best not to turn everyone into human popsicles. Now, your average bunch of folks might have just thrown in the towel, huddled together, and awaited their frosty fate, but not this group. Before long, they were searching through the wreckage like raccoons at a trash party, devouring any supplies and morsels they could find. Within days, their stockpiles were empty. That's when the unthinkable starts seeming, well, thinkable. With all the food gone, you face a choice: break a huge taboo or become an ice sculpture yourself. Some decided to go with option 1. These guys got resourceful with the only protein source left. Let's just say a few of their fallen comrades ended up being the main course for the group. 72 days after their cliffside Andean pile-up, 2 stragglers were spotted by a search crew and rescue. In all, 16 survivors out of 45 endured 2 months engaged in extreme cooking classes. The Issei Sagawa case. Issei Sagawa seemed to be just an ordinary guy living in Paris back in 1981. However, he had one weird obsession that no one knew about. He ate people. He just straight up murdered and cannibalized one of his classmates, a Dutch woman named Renee Hartveld. So imagine you're Renee. He shot you in the neck, made love with your corpse, and then spent days eating different parts of your body. Not just a little taste here and there, the man was full-on feasting on her remains. He even tried dissolving what he didn't want to eat in a bathtub of caustic soda. Now, once he got arrested, one would think that with his crimes, he's going away forever. But due to some old French insanity laws at the time, even though he was judged sane enough to stand trial, he just gets put in psychiatric detention for a few years. But the plot gets worse, as in 1986, they literally just let him go back to Japan while still under supervision. So he literally brutally murdered and ate someone, and he gets to just leave. Not only does Sagawa never really get properly punished, but he has zero remorse about the whole thing. The guy tries to capitalize on his newfound fame by writing books about his crime and doing interviews. No guilt, no empathy for his victim, just cashing in on being a cannibalistic murderer.